Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Wanted to thank you all for coming, especially registering for this in December and showing up in a new year. So kudos to, to those who made it. I'm Elizabeth with Friday. We are the communications partner for the REACH Collaborative, which is an initiative funded by the Lumina Foundation and led by Christine's group at Strategy Group, Jason at the University of Pittsburgh, and supported by DVP Praxis on the evaluation front as well. So excited to have you all here. And obviously we'll share more about what REACH is, but quick overview of the agenda for today. We're going to start with just a quick introductions, and then we'll talk about why REACH and a little bit about like why this work really matters from our perspective. And then as you'll learn, there are really kind of three pillars of strategies for REACH. And so Christine and Jason will kind of walk through some key strategies and best practices around those, share some examples out of states and colleges that the REACH Collaborative has been working with. And then we'll try and leave time for some Q&A as well for any questions. I do want to flag that we're really excited. The REACH Collaborative is going to be getting together in February for a nice convening. And out of that convening, we're going to have a lot more insights, resources, stories, etc. to share. We're going to be capturing some video footage, things like that. And so I'll do the plug at the end, but would really encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn, sign up on email, because we're going to have a lot more great content and resources coming up over the rest of the year. So for now, would love if folks would be willing to share. You're welcome to like hop off or on camera and share, or just type it in chat if that's the way you would prefer. Would really love to get to know who's on the call, share kind of name, who you are, what you do, and what you're hoping to get out of today's session. So give that a few minutes. You're welcome to jump off camera and share, or on camera, or put that into the chat.
Definitely want to encourage folks to rename your pins so that you have your organization there as well. Especially given the number of Ivanas that we have.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mariana Saucedo. I am the Senior Director of Program Innovation and Design at Propel America. For those of you who are not familiar with Propel, we work with high school age up to 26-year-old adults to streamline them to medical assistantship jobs and follow a jobs ready model. And so I'm excited to learn more about the work that you do with adults, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Welcome.
All right, we've got a few. Nice to see Sydney, Tracy, a few other folks chiming in. Hi, Melanie. All right. Anyone else want to share before I hand it over to the wonderful Katie? Okay. All right. Well, I'll hand it over to Katie with Lumina to give us the why this matters, because, you know, she and her team chose to fund this. So hopefully they have a good answer for it.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. I'm excited to spend a couple of moments just here at the top of our time together to really talk about the why, both behind the REACH Collaborative, and in particular, its focus and emphasis on centering adult learners of color. So before I joined the Lumina Foundation as a strategy officer for student success, I worked at a community college for more than 5 years. And during that time, I got to see firsthand how adult learners of color are focused, ambitious, and resourceful. I also saw firsthand how they were increasingly a sizable portion of the students at my institution, and certainly we see that nationwide. But so often our institutions are not perhaps designed to meet today's learners. And in particular, there can be policies, practices, and beliefs that are rooted in histories that really unfairly hold back these learners and so many others from achieving their goals of a better education and the benefits that come along with it. So that's really some of the kind of heartstrings work behind why we know that focusing on adult learners is really important. And I get to do this work alongside my colleague, Wayne Talaferro. So not only are adult learners important to focus on, but really want to call out why it's important for us to emphasize the needs of folks of color. So on the next slide, you'll see some statistics about how, despite our nation's progress and so many of our institutions working towards increasing completion rates for all students, we've seen stubbornly persistent attainment and earning disparities when we think about the outcomes for Black, Hispanic, Latino, and Native American adults. So this is really the imperative behind why we need to focus on not just all adults, but really thinking about what are the essential practices and policies that can support adult learners of color in achieving their goals and realizing the benefits of upward economic and social mobility that comes with a college credential. So together with the REACH Collaborative, which stands for Racial Equity in Adult Credentialing for Higher Education, we formed a network with 6 states supporting more than 140 community colleges who had many of the kind of conditions and commitments already in place to accelerate their work on supporting adult learners of color by creating clearer pathways. And so the Lumina Foundation has been really pleased to make this investment over the past 3 years and for the upcoming remainder of the project to really continue to accelerate and catalyze change in the field to ensure that pathways meet the needs for all of our learners. And so together, these 6 states and 140 community colleges are focused on a North Star goal together of seeing a 2% increase in credential attainment for their enrolled Black, Hispanic, and Native American adults. But we know that we can't just achieve this goal by wishing it into existence. And so, like my colleagues, Christine and Jason are going to share in more depth, the REACH Collaborative has a framework that's focused on 3 pillars of policies and practices that we know benefit adult learners of color. So they'll talk about these in more depth, but just want to highlight them here for everyone. The first is really helping community colleges to link their non-credit credentials into degree pathways. So knowing that oftentimes adult learners enter a college through a short-term or a non-credit credential, we want to make sure that they have a clear pathway to high-wage family supporting careers. And because many of us know that the barriers that students face is not only academic, a lot of times it's life circumstances and other learning supports that students need to be successful. We work with the states and institutions to think about how to bundle and sequence supports to really provide the resources that students need throughout their college journey so that they can get that ultimate goal of an associate's degree. And doing all of this while embedding culturally sustaining practices ensures that adult learners of color get the messages they need and feel that their experiences are recognized and highlighted so they know that they do have what it takes to be successful and attain their goals for both themselves and their family and communities. But I'll turn it over to my colleague Christine now to share in more depth what it looks like to build these stackable credentials and holistic supports for adult learners.
Well, thank you, Katie. And it's a pleasure to join you all today. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk just a little bit about credential to degree pathways, and wanted to share a little bit about the process that we used with these 6 states and the associated colleges that participated in the work of REACH. So there are a couple of key strategies that we wanted to emphasize. And as Katie mentioned, when you're working with adult learners, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, their entree into the institution is through a non-degree credential. And non-degree credentials are great and meaningful when they are credentials of value that are aligned to the labor market demand. So that's one of the things that is a really key piece of this work. But it's also important to make sure that we've created on-ramps to further credentials. So that can be an associate degree, it could be a bachelor's degree, or even beyond. And so what we want to talk about when we talk about credentials to degrees pathways is creating these seamless pathways that are easy for the students to navigate. So a couple key strategies that we talk about with this. The first of which is analyzing the labor market data for identifying what are the priority pathways for which you should begin this work. So what we did with the colleges is to create a nice little snapshot of their specific region, their service areas, so to speak, so that you could identify some really key targets for pathways. When we did this with the colleges, we encouraged them to focus on pathways that exist that you may just want to modify to help the institutions be prepared for better supporting the adult learners. The second thing was around exploring the demographic data associated with the pathway selection. So identifying who's in these pathways and who's not, how they're navigating these pathways, making sure that if you've got a large number of, let's say, Black men that are entering the pathway, but not many are finishing the pathway, then there's some sort of a gap or a disparity there that is ripe for us to be able to identify what the cause of that is, and then identify some interventions to address it. Third thing you see there is developing clearly defined agreements and processes for recognizing learning. Learning recognition is a broad umbrella term that we oftentimes refer to encompass things like credit for prior learning assessments, and the articulation of credit more broadly. So we want to make sure that institutions and state systems even are set up to be able to do this as automatically as possible so that we can minimize the disparities between who's taking advantage of learning recognition structures and who's not. The fourth thing that you see there is ensuring messaging around learning recognition is incorporated into as you advise and advertise these pathways. It's great to create a great structure to recognize learning, but if no one knows that it's there, you're probably missing out on a whole population of learners that you could be engaging without, because they don't even know that you will recognize their learning. So more and more, as you see colleges in particular advertising to learners, especially adult learners, they're talking about what you know matters, and here's how we can give you some progress towards your credential by sharing that. And the last thing that you see there is around engaging employers, the workforce leaders, and community partners in providing valuable input and or data to promote these pathway opportunities. Some of the employees at these respective institutions are likely to be able to take advantage of these pathways, especially when they're constructed in collaboration with the employer to meet their labor market demand. So you want to make sure that you're creating robust partnerships to engage these. And one of those examples we'll share here in just a moment with what North Carolina did. And they took a very deliberate structure. They used almost every element of this structure in order to implement their credentials to degrees pathways. So let's take a look at what North Carolina did. Most of their work was focused on the workforce credentials elements of this. And they created a joint partnership. And this joint partnership included folks from My Future NC, which is an entity that was specifically pulled together to look at workforce credentials. The governor's office, the community college system office, as well as commerce and workforce development entities. They pulled all of these folks together because they knew that there was a disparity in the talent needs and the levels of education that the talent pipeline had, which means that they're not going to be able to take advantage of the employment opportunities that are available. So you pull all these folks together and then you identify what are some of the non-degree credentials that need to be evaluated. So pull all of the different non-degree credentials together and have each of them evaluated against a set of criteria. Those criteria then can help elevate that credential as a credential of value. And those are the ones that you want to build strong, seamless pathways with those credentials of value. A quick note on credentials of value. It's important to realize that while not every credential leads directly into a high wage, high demand job, there are plenty of credentials out there that meet a need and may stack into something that meets that labor market demand or meets wage thresholds to be considered a high value credential. So that doesn't necessarily mean immediately eliminate it. It does mean look to see if there are opportunities to stack it into a high value credential if it doesn't lead directly there. So the credentials that are associated with those occupations in those in-demand sectors are then given some sort of hiring preference as the employers and the institutions and students are looking at those pathways. So think about that as an example of why creating these pathways, not just into the institution through those non-degree credentials, but moving through the institution and into the workforce become really important. And there's a whole host of other things that are important in terms of creating these credential pathways, including embedding work-based learning opportunities and other elements that we can talk about in another webinar. But did want to share just an interesting quote from Cynthia Liston, who is one of the leads on My Future NC, where she talks about the focus of REACH and in terms of increasing adult credentialing to meet the need to close the achievement gap is directly connected by having validated lists of credentials that students, schools, and employers are better prepared to understand the value attached to those credentials. In other words, in an era where we have more and more folks questioning the value of higher education and post-secondary credentials, creating a list that has been vetted and validated, not just by an institution, but also by employers, gives students the confidence to pursue that. And that's particularly important when adult learners have many competing priorities. What we'll do now is we'll talk a little bit about what some of the resources are needed for supporting adult learners as they're navigating these processes. For purposes of our pillar, we like to give it a nice pithy name. So in this case, we call it bundling and sequencing supports. It's many institutions, pretty much all institutions, have some level of support that they provide in the learners. But it's something different to be very intentional about where and when those are deployed and how they're communicated to the learners themselves. So one of the things we said was really important for institutions and for states, by the way, to create the enabling conditions for it, is to create a comprehensive list of the potential academic and non-academic supports that a learner may need along their path. And then you want to make sure to assess the institution's ability to provide that to all learners. And here's what I mean by that. We talk a lot about the students entering into the institution in a non-degree credential. In many cases, that's offered in the non-credit space within an institution. Some academic supports are not available to non-credit students. In some cases, non-credit students don't even have a student ID or an ID number. And so being able to assess the institution's ability to directly provide and connect the student to those resources becomes really important. The third thing you see there is ensuring that the institution's policies on access, as I mentioned, are equitable. So as I mentioned, if a learner in a cybersecurity credential pathway needs to brush up on reading or writing or math, or just needs to be able to access the library, you want to make sure that those resources are available to those learners. The next thing you see there is aligning supports within the pathway using either new or existing academic maps. So in some cases, institutions created a new map that says, if you are at this part of the pathway, here are some supports that are there to help you navigate it. If you are transitioning, for example, between a non-degree credential, I've already completed it, and now I'd like to continue my path on into an associate degree, then there may be a need, for example, to support with maybe placement testing or something like that. So using examples of here's where we know you're going to need this specific support. Another really great example is at onboarding. When you're onboarding a learner into a non-degree credential pathway, you'll want to identify what are their goals, what are their career aspirations that are associated with that. All of those, creating those, identifying what those needs are, and then aligning them. And that can be done with a nice solid path that is where you communicate what those supports are along the way. That makes it a lot easier for the students to navigate. And then the last thing that you see there is engaging external partners to supplement those supports that may be offered on campus. In some cases, those are service providers, community-based organizations, even some nonprofits and government agencies. So for example, being able to connect students to SNAP if food insecurity is a challenge. Transportation resources, even housing and fuel resources. So creating really intentional partnerships with those entities so you can directly connect students to that. Another key element of this that we don't go into a lot of detail here, and we can talk more about in another webinar, is the importance of individuals like navigators or one-stop shops that really help folks to navigate that. Let's take a look for a moment at what California did. So one of the things that they did is around really specifically addressing basic needs. And there's some statewide legislation that actually supports the establishment of basic needs centers within institutions. They also created a nice process for folks to get discounted transportation so that that's not a barrier for students being able to enter and complete their credential pathways. Got a couple of different Los Angeles area community colleges that are part of this success initiative that is specifically addressing those experiencing homelessness. And then you'll see, like I said, the Basic Needs Initiative. That is a system-wide approach to addressing the very fundamental needs that learners have as they're navigating these processes. So what you see here are some very specific examples of partnerships that can help institutions to better support the learners, particularly adult learners of color. And then the next thing we wanted to do is to just share a little bit from Sandy Fried, who is at the Student Success Center in the California Community College system. And she shares this really interesting perspective on why this matters. This significant investment recognizes how critical basic needs supports are to students and how much of a barrier it can basically be. They'll continue to scale shining examples where colleges are removing barriers for students through the framework of this Basic Needs Initiative. One of the things we don't talk a lot about here, but also plays a big piece in this, is parenting students and being able to address both childcare needs as well as others. So there's a whole host of things that fall under bundling and sequencing supports. And we have some resources to help both institutions and even states to create the systems and policies to support institutions that are interested in pursuing this. At this point, we're going to shift to my colleague Jason, who's going to share the third pillar, which is really focused on creating culturally sustaining environments when the students are in our learning spaces. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Christine. I'm going to take this moment to actually pause for a second and see if anyone has any feedback based on the information that Christine just presented on bundling and sequencing supports, and just any examples from your respective colleges that you'd like to share.
Have you had some partnerships? I know we've got some organizations on here that do these types of partnerships. Are there examples that you've seen work really well?
Well, one partnership that we have is with Caremont, which is our, big hospital. So it is so amazing. I mean, they are in there, we meet, we discuss, they want, you know, we're actually looking at possibly other pathways just because of the need in our community. So that right there has been a great partnership to help, you know, people of color and then all the other students, right? Trying to think what else. It just started making me think when I was listening to you about talking about the bundle of support. I started asking myself questions. Okay, do we have this? You know, is there a need for this? Like I'm thinking about transportation, and then when I seen the California information, I was like, okay. But we have to figure out if that's a true need for our students, right? So just kind of got my brain thinking about what other supports we might need that could better serve those people in the community.
And you brought up a really great point, because there are things that we think that students need, and then there are things that they actually need. And this is one of the things that Jason in particular is really passionate about, is that student voice element. The more often we actually talk to the students to find out what their needs are, the better off we're going to be. And we don't spin our wheels creating processes or policies to address something that's really not a major barrier for the population of students.
Yes, and I've reached out to Jason, and so this upcoming year, that's what we're working on. Our team is that student voice. I mean, I have had a passion for that because it's like, okay, we can do all this work, but is it in vain, right? And they want the students and the community want to see that they're being heard, right? So, yep. So, thank you, Jason, for that information you sent too.
Yeah,
And
definitely. No problem.
Christine mentioned like the importance, and a lot of colleges are using this kind of like navigator role. A lot of colleges as part of that are also kind of doing like intake surveys when students like first come onto campus. That is like, what are your needs? So that navigator is then more proactively prepared to address those. And so thinking about like student voice as you're researching what you need to improve, but also student voice just when they step on campus, like what resources can we help provide for you?
Right on. Anybody else want to share? I don't know how much time okay.
I think we're doing good.
Yeah, I think we are. We can go back to the title slide. It's fine. I'll say a little blurb. Okay. All right, so my name is Jason Kais. I'm a research associate at the University of Pittsburgh. Also a faculty member of sociology at Parkland College, which is here in Champaign, Illinois. I've been there since 2010, started off in adult education, teaching GED prep, and did some program administration within adult education as well before I transferred into 4-credit courses like sociology and teaching social work. So yeah, so in this section, we'll briefly talk about embedding culturally sustaining practices within degree pathways. Culturally sustaining practices focus on intentionally crafting curriculum, campus climate, programs, and policies to explicitly support and maintain students' heritage, values, cultural and linguistic pluralism, and with the goal to sustain and support multiculturalism. These practices make the sharing and protection of cultures an essential component to learning. Okay, so and what's important to note is that it takes a commitment to racial equity amongst internal stakeholders at the college, as well as support at the state and system levels to advance substantive academic and professional gains for racially minoritized adult students. So there has to be these internal conversations and external conversations with stakeholders outside of the college as well, explicitly stating and talking about racial equity for this to occur. Okay, go to the next slide. Right. So embedding culturally sustaining practices within credential to degree pathways involve the following strategies here listed. So evaluating cultural competency, strengths, and needs involves assessing the extent to which various student-facing and serving areas across the college work to equitably serve racially minoritized students. So we can look at the areas across recruitment and enrollment, academic advising, student services, faculty, of course, and career services. As Christine mentioned, capturing student voices, I'm really passionate about that coming out of adult education, knowing that adult students generally writ large, but especially Black and Brown adult students are oftentimes and many times ignored and what their needs are being ignored. So that's a very important part to me, is that students get the chance to not only speak, right, but that we're actually leveraging what they say, we're paying attention, and we're changing policies and practices within the college, even when it seems extremely challenging or, right, like not business as usual. We know that can stand in the way a lot of times for systems change, right? So capturing student voice is vital in obtaining an accurate sense of how students are being served, and it entails hearing from the students themselves, right? So most importantly is taking what students tell us about their experiences on and off campus. That's an important part right there, is the off-campus piece, and leveraging their perspectives to advance system change. So example methods of capturing student voice include interviews, focus groups, surveys, a combination of these things, as well as students' participation in governments at the college. Some of you are at the workshop we did about student voice, and we went to a little more detail about those methods. Applying an equity lens to prior learning recognition. So Christine informed us prior learning recognition allows students to obtain credit for experiences and competencies developed outside of the traditional classroom setting. Scholars have found that racially minoritized students are less likely to be aware of opportunities for PLR, so they tend to participate less frequently in those programs. One scholar found that Black students were the least likely of any racial group to know about PLR. So some of those recommendations, and one piggybacks off what Christine was talking about before, trying to close those racial equity gaps in PLR utilization, include proactive advising, transparency in policy, differentiated implementation, and extending federal student aid dollars to cover PLR examinations. So tapping into, we'll go to the next one down here, community cultural wealth, which was a concept developed by Dr. Terry Yasso. This involves recognizing, honoring, and leveraging racially minoritized students' unique ways of knowing about and moving about the world. So this area speaks largely to student voice, actually, right? And challenges practitioners to not only acknowledge differences across student groups, because sometimes we'll stop at, and that's diversity, right? We'll stop at that diversity piece and just recognize the difference. But what do we do after we recognize the difference, right? But we need to understand that Black and Brown students use myriad tools to successfully navigate racially inequitable systems within higher education, okay? Okay, and that last piece about assessing faculty representation and hiring practices. And there's a piece at the end I want to get to that's really important. So part of implementing culturally sustaining practices involves colleges assessing the extent to which racially minoritized students see themselves amongst faculty and staff members on campus. That's very, very important. You need to, and a lot of my previous work, professional work, was working with Black and Brown youth, right? And sense of self. Inherently, we want to believe in ourselves, but a lot of our social environments that interact with one another, right, these systems, tell us that many times that we're not enough, that we're less than, right? And it can be very challenging to see ourselves in positions of power and authority, you know? So those things are extremely important to be able to see yourself. And we think about the adult learner, by the time they get to us, Black and Brown adults, we've already been socialized with decades of experiences, many times telling us that we cannot make it, right? So even more importantly for Black and Brown adults, is that we see ourselves on campus amongst staff and faculty, okay? So colleges must be intentional about hiring and supporting, and that's big, a racially diverse team of professionals serving our students. So we're gonna go a bit further, and I say that it's important that colleges build a campus environment that does not further harm racially minoritized faculty and staff. So this can be addressed. So what I mean by harm is that too often your staff and faculty and these other staff and faculty, you have your colleagues, right, who identify as white, and many times you'll face racial microaggressions and things of that sort that don't make you necessarily feel like you're on a level field, right, as your colleagues, you know? So this can lead to get into racial battle fatigue. There's a lot of things that pop up as we can talk about this, but ultimately you can lose Black and Brown faculty and staff because they don't feel safe on campus, right? You don't feel as though you belong, okay? So we can address these partially through professional development opportunities on topics to further colleagues' racial consciousness, right? That's important. And my personal opinion is that we make these mandatory. That's my personal opinion. Okay. But also focus on questioning, crafting questions that target potential hires, their views on racial equity during the hiring process. So people are coming in who are going to be supportive of all of their colleagues, right? And pose critical questions and be accepting of being critiqued, right? About the ways they've been socialized along racial lines, right? And how we challenge power or not. Okay. Okay. If you go up one, just go back up there real quick. Yeah, any thoughts on that content? What kind of bubbles up when we talk about culturally sustaining practices in these 5 areas that I laid out? And what is that? What do you mean, Ivan, about do what anymore?
We have to be really, we have a
yeah.
new law that makes us be comfortable about, or not allow, doesn't allow us to ask specific questions in
Yes.
hiring processes about people's views on racial equity and things
Yes.
like that.
You're right.
New state law
I
just
know.
went into effect.
Yeah, I know. And I'm sorry. I forgot
That's
about that.
okay.
And maybe I'm suppressing it and I'm trying not to.
Yeah, I know, right? I wish we all were.
Yeah. That's so challenging. And I wish I had answers to that. I'd like to be more involved in those conversations as well, to see how do you do the work. Yeah. Yeah, that's a challenge. We had to talk more. Okay. Thanks,
Jason, we
Melanie.
had a comment from Melanie as well, looking
Yeah.
for examples on the.
Hi,
hiring.
I do have a question. So in terms of cultural navigation, so how in terms of best practices, be it faculty and staff, students, all of that, when we are in a society that is completely oblivious to the culture ways and all that of anybody except the would-be dominant group. And so in terms of even now where all these laws are being passed where history can't even be taught, then how do you sort of like it does sound good, but if you don't know, and if every metric that we measure stuff by is from a dominant group, from BMI to our babies growth and weight, all of those are not measures of any other culture but one.
Right. No, I completely. And so we're talking about a system of white supremacy, right? And how it had interlocking features that work, right, amongst themselves to feed themselves in order to propagate, right, the advancements of one group those who identify as white at the expense of others who are identified as other, right? Man, that's a very complex question, right? It's very hard. I think what we do is we try to get into spaces such as these where we can impact policy and practice, right? And we speak truth to power, and we put those lessons and competencies that we develop into practice to disrupt, right? To intentionally disrupt. Will we see change? Coming from a critical race theorist perspective, we believe that, racism is endemic and white supremacy is permanent. I think that there's, and I spoke to this at a previous webinar, there's a ways that sometimes we kind of lose hope, right? But I would say that what keeps us going is that we're fighting for our dignity. We're fighting with our students for their dignity and respect, right? So I hear you loud and clear. And I think that some of that student voice piece pops in there too, because our students are coming in, speaking from their experiences, and many times that their experiences are squashed, but they can be used as learning tools for everyone in that classroom environment, right? And hopefully we can see some ripple change occur. Does that kind of address what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I guess more or less. I mean, I understand sort of like your perspective, and I mean, it's
Oh, is
sort
it?
of you and I with our own life getting into. So it's sort of like difficult. I mean, navigating in a white space, really,
Yeah.
which is the entirety of the subject. But I mean, we can't give up our, like our foreparents fought hard
That's
for
right.
us to get to here. So, but it's just a question.
Yeah. No, I know I think that's ultimately what should fuel our work, a lot, right? Is especially in this program right now, this project with Reach. And we're looking at intergenerational racial oppression, right? We think about Black and brown adult learners and throughout our life course, as Black and brown adults, we've experienced various forces of white supremacy, right? And that should be vaulted and learned from across the college, right? And hopefully that it will shape policy and practices in the college. Yeah, but that's a lot harder conversation if you're in a state that's mandating that you don't. So I hear that.
Jason, I just want to say too, I love that you're pointing out about community cultural wealth, which I love as a theory in general. But I
Yeah.
think it's really helpful to think about, especially with adult learners, and especially our adult learners of color, is the idea that they don't necessarily want the campus community that our traditional students want, but that doesn't mean that they don't want campus community. That may just look a little bit different. So it may look like, and the research shows it's more of connections with professors or people in their programs, or workplace people in their field. So they're getting that academic piece and that workplace piece of it, but they're building that community cultural wealth that they may not have from the community that they're coming from. So examples to y'all would be, I think it would be real helpful for us going forward to have some examples of programs or policies that people have put in place to kind of to intentionally build that campus community for those adult students of color, whether that be, faculty-led or student-led or clubs or whatever it is that's really making an impact on building that community cultural wealth of the adult students on campus.
Right. I like that. Yeah, I'd like to hear more examples of how campuses are doing that work and infusing, right? Because the idea of community culture wealth is, that students are already coming with it, right? That, that it's the job of colleges to recognize this and then say, wow, that's a value, which is the challenge, I think inherently with a lot of places is that we don't see that there's inherent value in the ways of being and knowing that Black and brown students and Black and brown adults are bringing into our hallways. But yeah, I'd like to hear more examples myself too about what colleges are doing to support Black and brown learners, infusing their own ways of knowing. Yeah.
I will share that one of the things we did when I was at Prince George's Community College was to create what we call co-curricular learning communities, which is a very education ease way of describing it. But basically what it was an opportunity for students to connect to one another, to their discipline, what they were interested in, and to the faculty. And so we created some really intentional opportunities. Some of them were structured and some of them were less structured. And that was an opportunity for folks to bring with them the wealth, not just from their culture, but also what they know from a work experience perspective. We created, field trips, which if you've never been on a field trip with an adult learner, that is an absolute hoot. Because, I mean, they haven't in many cases been on a field trip in decades. And they just eat it up. Service learning opportunities, creating service learning opportunities where folks can, again, share what they know and also contribute. And so things like that we saw work really well for engaging, but it also not just helped the learners to feel connected, but also helped with retention. And ultimately completion. The students that were a part of that particular, we called it the STEM Collegian Center for the STEM version of it, The students that were a part of that, they had better outcomes than students who didn't have an opportunity or didn't take the opportunity. Didn't cost anything to participate, just a little bit of your time, once or twice a month. And they got mentoring as a part of it as well, which I think also contributed to the success. So anyway, just another example that of ways that we can actually tap into that community cultural wealth and demystify and create some connections between faculty and the adult learners themselves.
Nice. Thank you for that example, Christine. We'll just go to the next slide. We'll just briefly look at what Finger Lakes Community College is doing. And they crafted a relationship and nurtured a relationship with the Urban League of Rochester. And the Urban League has a rich history working towards racial equity within the community, creating programs that serve the community locally and nationally, right? There's many urban leagues. Organization serves over 25,000 members of the Rochester community through more than 25 programs. So Finger Lakes leaders develop a 4-reach credential to degree pathways with the Urban League and other organizations. And the Urban League is supporting the college's outreach and recruitment efforts. So they're speaking to individuals who participate in programs through the Urban League and letting them know, right, informing them that these degrees pathways do exist and how to onboard into and get further support at Finger Lakes within these pathways. Okay. And the last slide on my end is just a quote from Finger Lakes Chief Diversity Officer. Mainly, Dr. Covington is speaking to the transformative power of higher ed and how the REACH initiative is helping to achieve this or kind of vault this potential within higher education. And we know that higher education, especially for adults, and honestly, what prompted my passion to focus on Black and Brown adult learners and specifically Black men, referred to as grown Black men at community colleges, is this conversation of intergenerational wealth, right? Of this upward social mobility that can occur as parents and caregivers receive higher education credentials and go into the world of work and gain more money, right? But also gaining cultural capital. What community cultural wealth was based on, this idea of cultural capital. And one would be just the knowledge base on how to navigate higher education. I often bring up the example to my students and in conversations that I have with folks that, there's many families, and maybe some of us were part of those family units before. I was not that at the dinner table, you're talking about college visits. You're talking about how to fill out financial aid forms, and you're talking about A, B, and C, right? On how to successfully be a college graduate. And many families, you don't have that conversation. So you go into adulthood even, right? And you're just not really knowing that process. And if you have kids, it's hard to help them with that process, right? So I believe, yes, it is very transformative, or can be. All right.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jason.
Yeah.
We'll really appreciate Jason, Christine, Katie, and everyone who's chimed in, participated, attended. This is my little spiel. We would love to stay in touch. I'm putting in chat a few links for you. You can find our website, which has more information, in which we work hard to kind of regularly update with new resources and webinar recordings from other trainings that Jason and team are doing. The second link is our LinkedIn. So if you want to learn about future events and things like that, I encourage you to follow us there. And then always, if you're open for another email, I promise we send them few and far between with helpful stuff in them. The last link is a direct link to sign up for that if you all are interested in staying in touch, which we would love to hear from you all. We do have 7 minutes, so totally understand if people want to jump and take a breather before their next activity of the day, but also our team will stick around for the next 7 minutes. If there's any questions or connections you want to make, this time is yours for the next few minutes.
Thanks, Julia, for joining.
Thank you all.
So stay warm and dry. Good luck with that. I'm feeling like we may need to bolt down the furniture.
Yeah, the wind is howling here. I just texted Patrick and I was like, we might not be able to do online meetings this afternoon. I don't know how
Oh,
long
is
we're
it
gonna
really?
have power.
Yeah, there's some very serious wind warnings
Yeah.
going on. They have even in some cases canceled school
Wow.
Yeah,
for some places.
my kids got out 3 hours early today just because of
Mhm.
wind. They're worried about the school buses. So,
Is it cold enough to snow, or is it just
no,
Only in
we're just
some
gonna get a
areas.
lot of rain
a lot of rain?
Just a lot of rain.
Same thing here in Illinois.
and
We-
tornadoes.
Yeah,
Oh, you got tornadoes over there?
Yes,
Panama
Tonight, they're
City-
calling for them.
Yeah, Panama City got hit, I think with either one, or it was just the wind. We got it last night, the wind. We still have a little bit of carryover, but I think it's in Tallahassee now,
Wow.
making its way, so.
Yeah, we've had a
Well,
lot
stay
of rain.
safe,
We had
everybody.
a little bit of snow and it just said nope. So the rain washed it away. And snow is a pastime.
Sunny in California today, so.
Well, just keep telling us that because we'll be there in a
That's
month.
right,
So
right.
just keep reminding us how wonderful it is.
Malibu, here we come.
All right, y'all.
Well, I think I'm gonna call it
Thanks,
then.
Ivana.
Thanks everyone for joining in, and we'll get the webinar recording kind of cleaned up and put on the website and send some follow-up. So thanks everyone for taking the time.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
y'all.